Not like for 10 days, the little girl said while begging for food on the street to an old woman. But a millionaire recognized that child and did something shocking afterward. Comment giving a rating from 0 to 10 to my story. Your opinion is very important. And subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The cry sliced through the muggy afternoon air in the historic town like a blade, echoing through the cobblestone streets at precisely 3 o'clock. The 52-year-old widowed businessman nearly dropped his coffee cup as he turned away from his luxury apartment window. It was always at the same time, always with the same desperate intensity. For the past 3 weeks, that sound had been coming from the clapboard house across the street, a faded yellow 2-story building with peeling blue window frames that clashed with the sleekness of the modern high-rise where he lived. "Must be a kid's tantrum," he muttered to himself, adjusting his tie before returning to work. As the owner of the largest construction company in the region, he was used to solving complex problems, but he preferred to stay away from other people's dramas, especially after 5 years of living alone. Ever since he lost his wife on a rainy night, he preferred not to remember. His fortune had grown exponentially after investing heavily in stock market shares, but all the money in the world hadn't been able to fill the void she had left. Across the street, inside the clapboard house, the 4-year-old girl cowered in the corner of the kitchen, her small arms unable to comprehend why her aunt hated her so much. The 38-year-old woman held a metal spoon firmly that she had heated on the gas stove, her eyes red from the alcohol fixed on the child who trembled before her. "You're a plague on this house," the aunt hissed, her voice slurred from the cheap whiskey she'd been drinking since noon at the local dive bar. "Because of you, my sister is gone. Because of you, I lost everything." The spoon came down hard on the girl's small arm, leaving a red mark that would join the other scars that dotted her thin arms. The child bit her lip to keep from screaming louder. She had learned that screams only enraged her aunt further, who had worked at City Hall until she was fired for constant absences caused by her addiction. The girl closed her eyes and tried to remember her mother's soft voice, singing that lullaby before bed. It was all that was left of her now, fragments of memories and a melody that insisted on echoing in her mind during the most painful moments. "Stop whimpering," the aunt grunted, putting the spoon back in the drawer as if it were the most natural gesture in the world. "Go to your room, and I don't want to see you until tomorrow. And if you mess up the walls again with that dirty charcoal, you'll see what real punishment is." The girl ran to the small room at the back of the house, a stuffy space with an old bed and a crucifix on the wall. There, she curled up in the thin sheet and began to hum her mother's lullaby softly, the only thing that still comforted her. She didn't know that, across the street, someone had finally paid attention to that melody. The businessman stopped reviewing the contracts when he heard the faint but distinct sound. He knew that song. His wife used to sing it when she was cooking, a folk song about free birds. But where was it coming from? He approached the window again, his eyes scanning the facade of the clapboard house. One of the back windows was ajar, and from there came that childish voice, trembling but persistent. For the first time in 3 weeks, he felt something other than simple annoyance. There was something in that voice that struck a sensitive chord in his chest, something that reminded him of responsibilities long buried under layers of work and isolation. Next door to the clapboard house, the 61-year-old retired teacher was watering her begonias when she heard the girls singing. Unlike the businessman, she could no longer ignore the signs. During her 40 years of teaching, she had developed a sixth sense for children in distress. And that voice carried a pain that made her heart ache. How strange, she thought, observing the windows of the house, a family she had known for decades. The aunt had always been troubled, but since she had taken custody of her orphaned niece, something had changed in the air of that house. The girl never played in the yard, never ran through the streets like the other children in the historic town. The teacher dried her hands on her apron and made a decision. The next morning, she would pay a courtesy visit to her neighbor. It had been a long time since she had talked to her properly, and perhaps it was time to get to know the little girl better. The businessman remained at the window, an uncomfortable feeling growing in his chest. The song had stopped, but something in those few minutes had awakened memories he preferred to keep dormant. Memories of his former employee who had resigned abruptly 5 years ago, a few months before the accident. She was a kind woman, always humming while organizing the construction company's files. Then, suddenly, she had simply disappeared from his life, leaving only a formal resignation letter and many unanswered questions. He had never thought about her again until he heard that familiar song echoing from a house where a child seemed to be suffering in silence. The sun began to set over the mountains as the girl finally fell asleep, exhausted by pain and fear. Her small fingers clutched the sheet, and in her dreams she flew like the birds she secretly drew on the kitchen walls with pieces of charcoal found in the yard. Across the street, the businessman closed the curtains and tried to get back to work, but he couldn't concentrate. Something had changed that afternoon, something he didn't yet fully understand. For the first time in years, he felt that perhaps it was time to pay attention to what was happening beyond his own windows. Night fell on the historic town, but the echo of that children's song continued to resonate in the mind of a man who had spent 5 years fleeing from his responsibilities and of a retired teacher who had never been able to ignore the suffering of a child. The next morning brought with it the aroma of fresh bread from the local bakeries and the typical hustle and bustle of the historic town awakening to another day. The retired teacher put on her best floral dress and combed her grey hair with extra care. There was something in that child's voice that didn't leave her alone, an echo of hopelessness that she recognized from her years as an educator. At 9 o'clock sharp, she knocked on the door of the clapboard house. The sound echoed through the silent interior until shuffling footsteps approached. The aunt opened the door with a swollen face and red eyes, clearly suffering the effects of the previous night's drinking. "Good morning," said the teacher with her gentlest smile. "I came to pay a courtesy visit. It's been so long since we've talked properly." The aunt hesitated, running her hand through her disheveled hair. "Oh, teacher, it's not a good time. The house is a mess." "Nonsense, dear. We've been neighbors for so long." The teacher took a step forward, forcing the aunt to back down. "And I would very much like to meet your niece. I heard she's an adorable girl." The aunt's face hardened for an instant before forcing a weak smile. "The girl is sick, high fever. Better not get close." At that moment, a soft noise came from the kitchen, the sound of something being dragged on the floor. The teacher sharpened her ears, immediately recognizing the sound of a child trying to move silently. "Perhaps I can help," the educator insisted. "I have experience with sick children. I raised 3 kids, you know how it is." "No need, no," the aunt replied quickly, blocking the entrance with her body. "I already took her to the doctor. It's just a cold. It'll pass soon." The teacher noticed the woman's nervous hands, the way she avoided eye contact, and especially the strong smell of alcohol that emanated from her even though it was so early. All the signs she had learned to recognize during decades of dealing with troubled families. Across the street, the businessman watched the scene from his window while having breakfast. He had woken up earlier than usual, disturbed by confused dreams where the voice of a child mingled with memories of his former employee. When he saw the teacher at the door of the clapboard house, a strange curiosity washed over him. The educator finally said goodbye to the aunt, but not before casting an investigative look into the interior of the house. There was something deeply wrong there, and her experience told her that a child was suffering. As she walked back to her house, she decided that she needed to find a way to verify her suspicions. Inside the clapboard house, the aunt locked the door tightly and went to the kitchen, where she found the girl crouched behind the table, trying to hide. The child had tried to reach a glass of water from the sink, but her height didn't allow it, and she had knocked over a chair in the process. "Didn't I tell you to stay in the room?" the aunt growled, her irritation intensified by the hangover and the unexpected visit. "I was thirsty, Aunt," the girl mumbled, her big eyes fixed on the floor. "Thirsty?" The aunt laughed bitterly. "You want water? Then go get it in the yard. And since you like to make so much noise, you can stay out there until I decide you can come in." The girl went out to the small backyard, a space surrounded by high walls and dominated by a single tree. There she sat on the ground and began to draw with a piece of charcoal she had found near the gas stove. They were always birds. Small, big, some flying, others perched on imaginary branches. Each stroke represented her dream of freedom, of flying away from that house where pain was her only constant companion. The hours passed slowly. The aunt had locked the back door, leaving the girl in the yard under the strong midday sun. The child began to feel dizzy, but she knew that knocking on the door would only result in more punishment. So she began to sing her mother's song softly, the melody being her only source of comfort. It was this melody that reached the businessman's ears again. This time he couldn't ignore it. There was something too familiar in that voice, in that specific song. He picked up his cell phone and, almost without thinking, began to record. He didn't know exactly why, but an instinct told him that he might need that evidence. As he recorded, fragments of memories began to fall into place in his mind. His employee hummed that same song while working, the woman who had been an exemplary employee until disappearing abruptly. The woman who always spoke fondly about her little daughter, a girl with a familiar name. "The girl," murmured the businessman, the cell phone trembling in his hands. His employee's daughter was called that. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The child suffering in the house across the street was the daughter of his former employee, the kind woman who had worked for him for 3 years before simply disappearing. How hadn't he made that connection before? The businessman put away his cell phone and began to walk back and forth in his apartment. He vaguely remembered the employee mentioning family problems, a sister she didn't get along with, financial difficulties. But he was so absorbed in his own problems at the time, the growing conflicts with his wife, the problems in the company, that he hadn't paid due attention. Now, 5 years later, his employee's daughter was across the street, and from the sounds coming from that house, she wasn't in a good situation. The guilt that the businessman carried for the loss of his wife multiplied, now including the regret for not having helped his employee when she clearly needed it. At 3 o'clock, on the dot, the screams started again. This time the businessman didn't turn away from the window. He watched with growing horror as through the kitchen window of the clapboard house he saw a female silhouette moving aggressively. He picked up his cell phone again and began to record, this time with more determination. What he saw through the cell phone screen made him nauseous. The aunt was holding something in her hands. It seemed to be a kitchen utensil, and gesturing violently towards a small figure that he could barely distinguish. The girl's screams echoed through the afternoon, and this time the businessman couldn't pretend that they were just childish tantrums. When silence returned, he remained at the window for a few more minutes, his heart pounding in his chest. He had just witnessed something that would change everything. The question now was, what would he do with this information? The teacher, who had watched everything from her own window, felt her blood boil. 40 years dealing with children had taught her to recognize abuse when she saw it. She could no longer pretend she didn't know what was happening. That night, the girl slept on the floor of the yard, where her aunt had left her as punishment for making too much noise during the afternoon. The child curled up in her own t-shirt and looked at the stars through the branches of the tree. In her 4-year-old mind, she made a silent wish to her mother, wherever she was, that someone, anyone, would take her out of that place of pain. Across the street, the businessman couldn't sleep, tormented by the certainty that he needed to act, but paralyzed by the same emotional inertia that had consumed him since his wife's departure. His fortune in stocks and investments seemed useless in the face of the suffering of a child who had been within his reach all along. 3 days had passed since the businessman discovered the child's identity, and guilt consumed him like a slow fire. During these days, he had systematically documented the episodes of violence, always at 3 o'clock, always with the same methodical brutality. His collection of videos and audios grew, but his courage to act remained paralyzed by the same cowardice that had haunted him since the night he lost his wife. That Thursday morning, the teacher made a decision that would change the course of everything. She had spent the night awake, tormented by the certainty that a child was suffering a few feet from her house. Her 4 decades as an educator had taught her to recognize the signs, and all of them were present in the clapboard house. She decided to approach the situation differently. Instead of attempting a new direct visit to the aunt, she opted for a more subtle strategy. At 7 in the morning, she positioned herself in the side yard of her house, the place from where she had the best view of the backyard of the clapboard house. What she saw horrified her. The girl was sitting under the tree, completely alone, wearing only a torn t-shirt and underwear. Her small arms were marked by obvious burns, some still red and inflamed. The child was drawing on the ground with a piece of charcoal, creating shapes that the teacher recognized as birds. "My God," whispered the educator, her hands trembling as she held the fence that separated the yards. It was worse than she imagined. Much worse. The girl looked up and saw the lady watching her. For a moment, the two stared at each other in silence. Then, to the teacher's surprise, the child smiled, a weak but genuine smile, and waved shyly. "Hi, Grandma," said the girl in her tiny voice, using the affectionate term she gave to all elderly ladies. "Hi, my dear," replied the teacher, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Are you okay?" The girl glanced quickly at the windows of the house before answering. "Yes, I am. I'm just drawing little birds." "That's nice. Do you like birds?" "I like them a lot. They can fly wherever they want," replied the child, her big eyes shining with a sadness that broke the teacher's heart. At that moment, the aunt's rough voice echoed from inside the house. "Girl! Where are you?" The terror that instantly took over the child's face said everything the teacher needed to know. The girl got up quickly, wiped her hands on her t-shirt and ran into the house, but not before looking once more at the educator with an expression that screamed for help. The teacher remained in the yard for a few more minutes, processing what she had seen. The burns, the fear, the way the child reacted to the aunt's voice. Everything confirmed her worst fears. She could no longer pretend she didn't know what was happening. Meanwhile, across the street, the businessman had witnessed the entire interaction. Through his window, he could partially see the yard, and the sight of the marks on the girl's arms made him sick. For the first time in 5 years, he felt genuine rage burning in his chest. His employee had trusted him in some way. Even if indirectly, even if he didn't know it at the time, she had left her daughter in the care of a family that lived in the same town where he lived. And now that child was being tortured while he watched from his comfortable window, paralyzed by his own cowardice. At 11 in the morning, the teacher made a courageous decision. She put on her best Sunday dress, took a tray with homemade cookies she had prepared as a pretext, and headed again to the clapboard house. This time, she wouldn't take no for an answer. The aunt answered the door reluctantly, clearly annoyed by the neighbor's persistence. "Teacher, I already told you it's not a good time." "Honey, I brought some cookies I made yesterday," the educator interrupted firmly, "and I insist on getting to know the little girl better. As old neighbors, it is our duty to support each other." Before the aunt could protest, the teacher had already entered the house, using all the authority that decades of classroom experience had given her. The interior of the clapboard house was dark and smelled of mold mixed with alcohol. Old and poorly maintained furniture occupied the room, and there was a heavy atmosphere that made the air seem difficult to breathe. "The girl is sleeping," the aunt lied, blocking the way to the back of the house. "What a pity. Maybe another time, then," said the teacher, but her experienced eyes had already catalogued several disturbing details. Dark stains on the kitchen floor that seemed to have been poorly cleaned, a metal spoon left on the gas stove, and especially small charcoal drawings on the walls that had clearly been made by a child. At that moment, a low sound came from the direction of the kitchen, a muffled sob, almost imperceptible. The teacher and the aunt froze. The silence that followed was tense and revealing. "Must be the neighbor's cat," the aunt said quickly, but her voice trembled slightly. The teacher smiled and nodded, but had decided she had seen enough. "Well, I'll let you rest then. But remember that I'm always here next door if you need anything." Anything at all. The educator's tone made it clear that it wasn't just a casual offer of help. It was a subtle but direct warning. After the teacher left, the aunt locked the door tightly and went to the kitchen, where she found the girl curled up behind the gas stove, trying to hide. The child had cried when she heard the teacher's kind voice, remembering the kindness she had once known. "You were making noise," accused the aunt, her eyes already shining with familiar fury. "No, Aunt, I didn't make noise," protested the girl, but her small voice sounded weak even to her. The aunt took the metal spoon that was on the gas stove and put it directly in the flame. The girl recognized the ritual and began to tremble. She knew what was coming next. "You want to draw attention, don't you?" hissed the aunt while the spoon heated up. "You want the neighbors to come here asking questions. Do you think I don't know how to take care of you?" Across the street, the businessman had positioned his cell phone at the window and was recording again. This time, he managed to capture not only the sounds, but also partial images through the kitchen window. What he saw made him make a decision that would change everything. He could no longer be just a silent observer. His employee had been a good person, a dedicated employee who always spoke of her daughter with love. That child was his responsibility now, whether he wanted it or not. While the girl suffered another episode of systematic torture, the businessman made a call he hadn't made in months. He called his personal lawyer and old college friend, David Miller. "David, I need your help with a delicate situation," he said, watching through the window as the girl's screams echoed through the afternoon. "It's about a child, and I think it could be a matter of life and death." The teacher, who had returned to her house, also made a radical decision. She picked up the phone and dialed a number she knew by heart. The city's social services hotline. It was time to involve the competent authorities. "I need to report a case of child abuse," she said when they answered. "It's urgent, very urgent." That night, after the aunt fell asleep drunk on the living room sofa, the girl managed to sneak out into the yard. Her newborns burned, but the physical pain was less than the pain in her heart. She sat under the tree and looked at the stars, humming her mother's song softly. What she didn't know was that, for the first time in months, someone was truly paying attention to her suffering. In fact, two people had decided to act, and in the coming days, her life would change in ways she couldn't even imagine. The businessman spent the whole night awake, planning every move. His fortune in bitcoins and diverse investments would finally have a purpose beyond accumulating zeros in bank accounts. For the first time since his wife's departure, he felt he had a real mission. David Miller arrived at the businessman's apartment on Friday morning with a grave expression on his face. The two men had been colleagues at the university almost 3 decades ago, and David knew well the emotional isolation that his friend had built after the loss of his wife. Therefore, the urgent phone call the night before had surprised him so much. "I need you to tell me exactly what is happening," said David, sitting in the spacious living room of the apartment. "You talked about a child in danger, but I need details." The businessman served coffee and positioned himself next to the window, the place that had become his obsession in recent days. "The girl who lives in the house across the street is the daughter of a former employee of mine. She is being mistreated by the aunt who takes care of her. Maltreated how? Asked David, taking a notepad from his briefcase. Burns, daily screams, neglect. The businessman paused, struggling with the words. I have recordings, David. Evidence of what's happening. David was silent for a moment, processing the information. This is very serious. If you have evidence of child abuse, you need to contact Child Protective Services immediately. I know, replied the businessman, running his hands over his face, but there's something more. My employee worked for me for 3 years. She left abruptly in 2019, a few months before the accident. I never understood why, but now you feel responsible, completed David, understanding the emotional complexity of the situation. The businessman nodded. If I had paid more attention at the time, maybe I could have helped. Maybe she wouldn't have had to leave her daughter with that woman. At that moment, the familiar sound of screams echoed from the house across the street, even though it was only 9 in the morning. Both men turned to the window, and David could see the expression of anguish on his friend's face. Does this happen every day? He asked, horrified. At 3 in the afternoon, religiously. But sometimes also at other times, replied the businessman, picking up his cell phone. Do you want to see the recordings? David watched the videos in growing silence, his face paling with each scene. As a lawyer specializing in family law, he had seen many cases of child abuse, but something in the systematization of that violence disturbed him deeply. We can't wait any longer. I need you to give me all these recordings today. I'm going to contact Child Protective Services and the District Attorney's Office. This child needs to be removed from that house immediately. While the 2 men planned the intervention, across the street, the girl was living another day of terror. The aunt had woken up with a particularly severe hangover and discovered that there was no more alcohol in the house. Her irritation multiplied when she found new drawings of birds that the girl had made on the kitchen wall during the early morning. How many times do I have to tell you not to mess up the walls? Shouted the aunt, holding the girl by the arm hard enough to leave marks. You're a plague, a curse on this house, the girl tried to explain, to say that she had dreamed of her mother and that the drawings made her feel less alone. But the words were lost in sobs. At 4 years old, she still didn't fully understand why her aunt hated her so much, why each day brought new pain. You're going to be locked in the room until I decide what to do with you, continued the aunt, pushing the child down the hallway. And if I hear even a noise, you'll know a punishment you've never experienced before. The room where the girl was locked was small and stuffy, with only a high window that she couldn't reach. There she curled up in the corner and began to hum her mother's song softly, the melody being her only source of comfort in a world that seemed to have forgotten that she existed. It was this song that the teacher heard when she passed by the house on her way to the grocery store. The educator had spent the entire night thinking about the conversation with the girl in the yard. The marks she had seen on the child's arms, the atmosphere of fear that permeated that house. The teacher stopped in front of the gate and listened. The girl's voice was weak, but full of a sadness that made the educator's heart break. At that moment, she made a decision that would change everything. Instead of going to the grocery store, the teacher went directly to the historic town's city hall, where the small office of Child Protective Services was located. She knew the counselor Sarah Miller well, a former student of hers who had dedicated herself to the protection of vulnerable children. Sarah, I need to talk to you about a very serious situation, said the teacher, entering the office without ceremony. Sarah looked up from the papers she was analyzing. Teacher, it's good to see you. What brings you here today? A child in danger, my neighbor. I'm sure she's being mistreated. Sarah straightened in her chair, her expression immediately becoming serious. During her 5 years as a Child Protective Services counselor, she had learned to recognize when a report was serious, and the teacher was not the type of person who would make frivolous accusations. Tell me everything, said Sarah, picking up a complaint form. While the teacher was reporting her observations, Across town, David was in a similar meeting at the district attorney's office. District Attorney Michael Johnson listened attentively while David presented the evidence collected by the businessman. "This is compelling evidence," said the DA, examining the videos on David's cell phone. "I will order an immediate investigation and request the removal of the child from the family environment." "How long will this take?" asked David, worried. "With this evidence, we can act today," replied Michael. "I'm contacting Child Protective Services now." Thus it was that, by a coincidence that would change the fate of the girl, two simultaneous complaints arrived at Child Protective Services on the same morning. Sarah was finishing writing down the teacher's report when her phone rang. Child Protective Services, Sarah Miller speaking. "Sarah, this is DA Michael Johnson. I need you to make an urgent intervention at a house on Main Street. We have evidence of serious child abuse." Sarah paused, the pen suspended over the paper. "Is it by chance the yellow clapboard house?" "Exactly." "How did you know?" "I just received a complaint about the same house," replied Sarah, looking at the teacher in surprise. "Two independent sources. This confirms the severity of the situation." At 2 in the afternoon, a coordinated operation was being set up. Sarah, accompanied by 2 social workers and a sheriff's deputy, was heading to the clapboard house. The teacher had offered to accompany the team, using her experience with traumatized children. The businessman watched everything from his window, his heart pounding in his chest. Finally, after days of paralysis, he had managed to act. David was beside him, both witnessing the moment that would change the girl's life forever. "You did the right thing," said David, placing his hand on his friend's shoulder. "I hope it's not too late," replied the businessman, his eyes fixed on the team that was approaching the clapboard house. In the house, the aunt had gone out to buy alcohol at the local bar, leaving the girl locked in the stuffy room. The child continued singing softly, unaware that her life was about to change radically. When Sarah knocked on the door of the clapboard house and received no answer, she used her legal authority to enter the property. What they found inside surpassed even their worst expectations. A dirty and poorly maintained house, a strong smell of alcohol, and obvious signs of neglect in all the rooms. It was the teacher who first heard the weak voice coming from the room at the back. "Someone's here," she said, guiding the team down the hall. When they opened the door to the room and found the girl curled up in the corner, singing her sad song, everyone present felt a pang in their heart. The child raised her big, scared eyes, not understanding who those people were or what they wanted from her. "Hi, honey," said Sarah, crouching down to be at the child's height. "My name is Sarah. We're here to help you." The girl looked at the teacher, recognizing the kind lady who had talked to her in the yard. A glimmer of hope shone in her eyes, but was quickly replaced by fear. "The aunt will be mad," she whispered. "You don't have to worry about that now," said the teacher, reaching out to the child. "We're going to get out of here, okay?" The girl's departure from the clapboard house was a moment that would be etched in the memory of all those present. The child held the teacher's hand firmly, her steps small and hesitant as she crossed the door that had been her prison for so many months. Across the street, the businessman watched emotionally. For the first time in 5 years, he felt that he had done something truly important. His fortune would finally serve for something beyond accumulating interest and dividends in banks. 3 months later, the girl was living a new reality. The businessman had become her legal guardian, transforming one of the rooms of his penthouse into a true children's paradise. The retired teacher had become a constant presence, helping in the adaptation and emotional recovery of the child. The little ones still drew birds, but now they were happy birds, flying in blue skies that she painted with colored paints on white papers. Her burns had healed, leaving only physical marks of a past that was slowly beginning to be healed by a lot of love and patience. And when she sang her mother's song, it was no longer a lonely lament, but a melody of hope that echoed through the corridors of a home where she was finally loved and protected, as she always deserved to be. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring you videos every day that will make your life happier. Comment what you thought of my story, giving a rating from 0 to 10, and thank you very much.